Hello and welcome to this episode of Own the Journey, where we are interviewing incredible people from around the world. And today is an extra special day because I get to interview my dad. And Kerry Douglas, who's been a practicing lawyer for many years and done some incredible things in the town of Bolivar. And it's just a special time for me to be able to ask some fun questions and share the wisdom that you've helped me have as we've grown up and share it with some amazing people from around the world.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So, well, so for those of you that, for those in our audience that don't know your history and what you do, tell us just a little bit about your years of practicing law and how you came into the world of helping to build one of the best rural hospitals in America.
Well, I was born and raised in Bolivar, as were you. Mm-hmm. Went to the University of Missouri in 1964. University of Missouri at Columbia. At that time, there was a 3-year program where you could go into law school after 3 years, mm-hmm. and your first year of law school counted as your last year of undergraduate. So I graduated in 1970. After that, I went into the Army. I was licensed at the time I went into the Army. I served at the Adjutant General's Corps at Fort Knox, Kentucky, for 20 months. It's supposed to be 24, but Vietnam was winding down and they were wanting rid of people. So I got a 4-month job. My wife and I, Cinda, your mother, made the decision to return to Bolivar, although when we originally left we had doubts that we would, but nevertheless we moved back to Bolivar and joined my dad in the practice of law, who had been there since 1932. And he in turn had joined his dad, who started practicing law in Bolivar in 1912. So there's been a continuous Douglas law firm since 1912. What's that, 111 years now, mm-hmm. roughly. And of course, as you know, your brother Pat is now one of the partners at the law firm, and I retired mostly, and
as much as the Douglas retires.
As much as the Douglas retires in late 2012.
And in making the transition in working with your dad, I know that wasn't always easy, and there were some challenges in coming into the practice of law and working alongside your dad. Tell us just a little bit about how the family dynamics of business and family came together.
Well, actually, my dad and I got along pretty well. I have an older brother who's 14 years, he's deceased now, but he's 14 years older than I was. And he went to Harrisonville to practice law because he and my dad agreed that they could never get along in the practice of law. Even though they loved each other, their personalities were too similar. Mm-hmm. My dad and I always pretty well got along, and it was great to have him as a mentor because he had been practicing for 30 some odd years at that point in time when I came back. So he was a great mentor, and I would see a client in one office and think, oh, now what's the answer to that question? And go running into Dad, excuse myself, and say, hey Dad, I've got a question I need to have your help with. Mm-hmm. So it was really special. Oh. It was not like a lot of parent-child relationships in business where there is difficulty in getting along. Dad and I always got along pretty well.
That's awesome. And talk to us just a little bit about how you decided to get involved with the hospital project.
That was came along in the mid-70s. There was a banker then living by the name of T.H.B. Dunnigan, who was president of the Polk County Bank and came from a long Polk County family of Dunnigans. And he called the newspaper publisher and editor into the bank one day, and I think it was 1976, and said, I've been checking other towns with rural hospitals, and a lot of them are smaller than Bolivar, don't have the business that Bolivar does. Why can't Bolivar have a hospital? So that was really the beginning of it. That was the seed. Mm-hmm. And so Jack Zimmerman, the publisher, and Jim Sterling, the editor, went back to the paper and wrote up an editorial which basically says, why don't we have a hospital? So an informal committee got together, started working on some ideas and concepts, and I mean, developing a new hospital from scratch is not like building an addition to a building. I mean, it is very, very difficult. So at some point in time, I think around 1977, the committee brought me in because of my legal knowledge. And I started participating with the committee, and then we went through 5 years of planning, asking permission from the regulators, which was a very difficult task, getting the hospital built and getting it opened in September of 1982. And I was involved in all that process. In 1979, the committee proposed the formation of a hospital district, and that was approved by the voters. And the next step was to elect a board of directors. And I ran for the board as one of the initial 6 members and was elected, and then was elected as chairman of the board and served in that capacity for about 27, 28 years. When I retired as chairman, I continued on the board for a period after that, and then retired after 32 years on the board. So I started just as a matter of helping out a few friends with some ideas, and ended up being a, I don't want to call it a career because it was all non-paying, but it was a charitable endeavor that lasted for over 32 years.
And has blossomed into an incredible hospital that's saved thousands and thousands of lives over the years.
I would agree with that. I'm very, very proud of the work we did on the hospital. When we opened, we had 90 employees. Today, the hospital has something over 2,000.
Wow.
Our budget was, if I remember right, was $3 or $4 million when we opened, and today, I don't even know what the budget is anymore, but it's approaching $1 billion between the hospital and the foundation that we subsequently created to do some long-term care and property ownership.
That's amazing. Well, I wanted to take a few minutes and share that, just because it was such a special part of your life and our lives as we were growing up, and has actually transformed the community. I mean, Bolivar has become very insulated from some of the other economic challenges that small communities run into because of the hospital being there.
It has definitely. When I came back to Bolivar in 1972, if I remember right, the population was like 4,700, and today it's approaching 12,000. Yeah. And the hospital and the university, SBU, and some other businesses have provided a fantastic economic base for the city.
Yeah. That's amazing. So shifting into the practice of law just a little bit, we all hear that families and businesses need to have a good lawyer, a good CPA, a good bank, and in today's world, I would argue a good technology company. But I think that there's a lot of challenges for people because they don't understand what it means to hire a lawyer. So what are some of the characteristics that you think an individual or a business needs to consider, some of the questions that people need to ask to make sure that they're picking out somebody that matches them well?
Well, let me start off by saying when I first started practicing law in 1972, I was a general practitioner. I did a little bit of everything. Mm-hmm. I did some state planning, I did some business law, I represented the city, I represented several schools, I represented several banks, I did some criminal law, I did some traffic law, I mean, you name it, I did some plaintiff's work, you name it and I did it. As time progressed, it became more and more difficult to be a generalist. Laws changed, the legislature changed laws from time to time, courts adjusted the common law from time to time, and it just became more and more difficult. So as time went on, I began to narrow my practice into the fields of, actually it was still pretty broad, but into estate planning, business law, municipal law, school law, and banking law, as well as contracts and real estate, which you have to do as a part of all of the of all the above. So when a family goes to pick out a lawyer for their personal planning, for their estate planning, or for whatever other problem of a legal nature that they may have, my thought has always been the best way to find a good lawyer is to find out from your friends and neighbors who are with a lawyer, get a recommendation. I mean, you can go based upon advertising, which wasn't legal when I first started practicing law, but subsequently became legal. But my point is that I always believed that the bulk of my practice came from referrals, that I represented Joe Blow, and Joe Blow told John Smith, and John Smith told Jane Ann. You know, Kerry Douglas is the guy to go to if you want your estate planned, or if you have a small business and need some business work. So when it comes to picking out an attorney, it depends upon what you need the attorney for, because you don't want a lawyer who specializes in criminal law doing your estate plan, and you don't want an estate planner like I was doing criminal law, because the law has become more and more specialized. Yeah. And I would say for a business, which you have, which you represent at J-Mark, you need to find, again, referral from a lawyer who has a lot of experience in business, who knows something about corporate law, who knows something about real estate, if you're involved in real estate, knows something about personal property, who can read your balance sheet if you need some help, so have a little bit of finance background, which I happen to have. And so my recommendation has always been get a recommendation from people who have used attorneys who have done them a good job in the particular area that they need help with. Yeah, I think that's really sage advice. I think some of the challenges that small businesses in particular run into is they think that because they know a lawyer that they can just pick that person and then they're going to represent them well. And to your point, I think some of the challenges that have evolved over the last couple of years for many businesses are because they don't have good advisors in whatever area that they're focused on that specialize in those areas of focus. The other thing that I think is important in choosing a lawyer, and that is that at some point a client may have a question that the lawyer is just not familiar with. For example, I'm not into securities law, the federal securities law. So you need a lawyer who is willing to say, I don't know, but I'll get you the help you need. I'll refer you to another attorney who specializes in this area or who has familiarity with it. I think that's very important, because the last thing you want is a doctor who doesn't know what he's doing in a particular illness, or a lawyer who has exceeded his knowledge, skills, and training. And didn't have the humility to say, let me get you some help. Exactly. Yeah, that makes a huge difference. So for business owners who have started a business and have heard that they need to put a trust in place and that they need to do some estate planning and legacy planning, but don't really understand why. Talk to us just a little bit about why it's so important that business owners in particular have a plan, but then in general, why all families should have a plan. Well, it starts with that first child almost. because if something happens to mom and dad, and there's not a plan for who's going to take care of the child, if something happens to mom and dad, who's going to take care of the children, who's going to administer the estate, who's going to collect the life insurance, assuming there is some, who's going to administer that life insurance for the benefit of the children or whoever the benefit is, beneficiary is. So it starts early. And certainly as a business owner, if there's not a plan of somebody who can step in and manage that business, retain its profitability, hopefully, until it can be sold, it's very important that you have all that in place. There's two aspects of estate planning. There's life planning, and then there's death planning. Life planning includes things like durable power of attorney, so that if you're ill or become incapacitated for some reason, that there's somebody in place who can take care of your day-to-day business. In addition, if you regretfully become terminal, a healthcare directive telling your family and telling your physicians and your healthcare providers what care you want and don't want is vitally important. And then in terms of trust or wills, when I first started practicing law, everybody had a will. Very, very few people had a trust. Only the people who were quite wealthy had a trust. And everything else was a will, which had to go through probate. So it added some time and it added some expense, not near as much time and generally, and not near as much expense as a lot of people think, but nevertheless, a will has to pass ownership of property through probate to the beneficiaries. A trust, on the other hand, does not have the court intervention unless it ends up in a dispute, which hopefully with good planning it won't. A trust has many, many benefits. One of them is it's very flexible, so that if I have child Tom and I have child Pat, and one child dies, then that trust can provide for your minor children or whoever I want my estate to go to if you're not alive. And I can plan and create trust for those younger children who may not be able to manage their estate properly until an older age. So, and then you've got to have somebody in a position to step in, manage your business if you're in a business, or your farm if you're in a farm, or your general estate if you're employed, otherwise by self-employed, and all that can be done through a trust. And in choosing a lawyer to do that, again, I go back to the fact that you need to find a lawyer who has the training, the experience, and the ability to tailor your plan through the trust, will, power of attorney, healthcare directive, whatever other documents may be needed. Tailor that to meet the requirements of this particular family. You don't just crank out a form if you're a good lawyer.
It's got to be specific to the needs and expectations.
You can start with a form,
sure,
but then you need to modify that form to meet the particular circumstances and needs of that family.
And one of the other things that you've shared with me is that you don't have to make a decision now for 20 years from now or 50 years from now. It's something that you can revisit and update and change. And so as the family dynamics shift or the age of your children, as they become capable of managing their own estate, you can change the way that the dynamics of a trust works so that you don't have to try to plan for some crazy time down the road.
That's exactly right. And I would emphasize that once I do an estate plan, back when I was practicing actively, I would tell the client, okay, make a note, 5 years from now you need to come back and see me unless something happens within the family within that time. Let's take a look in 5 years. That's kind of was my rule of thumb. Not everybody did it, but I diaried my own calendar and would send a reminder to clients that, hey, you might want to come in, let's take a look and see if what we did 5 years ago still meets your needs appropriately.
Yeah.
It's not that much to just go in, take a look, and if you need some adjustments, you make them.
Make some tweaks. Yeah, that's awesome. So I know that over the years you've had many crazy clients and some clients that you have become lifelong friends with. Tell us a story about when you had to just walk away and fire a client because it wasn't worth it.
Well, I always took the view that I was being hired for my skills, my knowledge, and my ability to work within the legal system to get a goal accomplished of whatever the client wanted to accomplish. Sometimes, however, the client does not understand that what they want is just not doable, or not doable to the extent that they want it. And so my view has always been, if they can't listen to my advice, because I was a skilled, in my opinion, a little selfishly, I was a skilled attorney, and if it came down to a particular issue and they just said, I'm not doing it, then I would say, well, you probably need to get you another lawyer, and we'll settle up, and I'll give you a referral if you want me to. If not, you find your own attorney.
Mm-hmm. So it was just...
I didn't have to do that very often.
Yeah. Well,
because usually people, if they hire a lawyer they trust, then they will accept their recommendation, even if they don't always like it.
Yeah. You kind of back to that. Sometimes you have to, one of my favorite sayings is you have to fall in love with the truth even when you don't like it.
Yeah, there you go.
It's just the way that it is. So on the converse of that, you've had an impact on many families over the years. What's one of your favorite stories around helping and making a difference with some of your clients?
Well, in terms of families, the thing that has always intrigued me is that a family will come in for an estate plan and they'll say, well, we want, we don't want to favor this child over that child and name him as executor or as trustee or whatever the case may be. And I always tell them, just remember, being a trustee is a job, it's not an honor. Mm-hmm. And unless the child or children have some ability, some skills in the background as to how to administer an estate or a trust upon the death of the parent or the decedent, then they need to maybe find an outside trustee, a professional trustee. And I've done that many times, and the families have appreciated it in the long run. Mm-hmm. One of my favorite stories pertains to a business, and because it's a case that's reported in the reporters, I can talk about it without violating confidence. I was privileged to represent Southwest Electric Co-op, which is one of the larger co-ops in the state of Missouri, mm-hmm. that serves Bolivar, Dallas County, Polk County, Hickory County, part of Greene. In any event, it's a large one. When Walmart was going to build their supercenter in Bolivar, it was outside the city limits at the time, and so they started building. And because it was outside the city limits, they used the co-op for their construction power and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But Bolivar was in the process of annexing. So I advised the co-op on how I felt like it was necessary for them to be able to obtain permanent service. And they did so. And then as soon as it was annexed, why Empire, now Liberty, but Empire District, sued the co-op because they felt like as the power provider in the city, they were entitled to serve them. And I had everybody in the law firm tell me, you're never going to win this, you're never going to win this, you're never going to win this. So we went to trial on it, lost at the trial court level, took an appeal to the Missouri Court of Appeals, Southern District in Springfield, and my theory on why we had done everything right turned out to be correct. And the result was that the co-op was able to serve Walmart, is still serving Walmart to this day, to the tune of, I'm sure, many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars of revenue over the years. Those are the kind of challenges that I thrive on and that a good lawyer thrives on. It was a you can't win this. Yes, I can. I know I can. And then you do.
Then you do.
Yeah.
So maybe I got a little bit of my stubbornness from my dad. Give me a challenge and watch me knock it out.
That came from two sides, probably.
Yeah, I would say that's probably true. So if you were going to go back and talk to yourself in 1972 when you were beginning to practice law, what advice would you give yourself?
I am quite proud of my years of practicing law and my years of working with the city and school board and CMH, the hospital. I don't know that there's a lot that I would change if I was advising myself all over again. However, the one thing that I probably would tell myself, my older self, is don't be afraid to charge for your value. I was always hesitant to raise rates, to increase retainers. I just liked my clients and I didn't want to run them off and whatnot. But as I learned as I went on, if you're a good practitioner, if you're a good technology firm, if you're a good physician, people are going to pay the price for good services. And I probably would tell myself, don't be afraid to increase your rates, explain to the client why. It's not just selfish, but you've got overhead to pay, you've got secretaries and legal staff who expect reasonable raises from time to time, your operating costs increase. So I would probably tell myself, don't be afraid to charge for what your value is.
I think that's really good advice, and I can relate. We, over the years, have gone through some of those same challenges of being concerned about raising rates, knowing that we have the business has to be sustainable, and one of the things that we've had to teach both our own team and our clients is you want to work with an organization that has safety built into the organization. It's got a little bit of a cushion because winter is coming, bad times are going to occur, and if you don't put a little bit of money in the bank for those hard times, then when they happen, you could collapse, and then you're not there to support them as you need to in whatever capacity that might be. So, yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to overcharge, no. And I, certain businesses and law firms and whatnot probably charge what I would consider to be an excessive amount, but you've still got to charge what your value is, yes. What your worth is.
Yeah,
whatever that may be.
Yeah, I totally agree. So focusing in just a little bit on technology as it relates to the practice of law and all the things. I think you guys did a fantastic job. It was fun growing up and watching you make investments into technology kind of before technology was cool. You had a business partner, Gary Lynch at the time, who was a little geeky. He was a little bit on the forefront that helped drive that.
More than a little.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit about how that helped you all all at the time and still today as a firm, serve your clients and create the best value?
Dad and I hired Gary as an associate in 1976, 4 years after I joined the firm. And after my dad died in 1979, unexpectedly, Gary and I were practicing alone. And this was before the firm started growing. But Gary said, we need to computerize. And I said, what's that? It's about what I knew about it all. I knew generally what it was. But this was 1981, long before most law firms, even medical clinics, other businesses were computerized. So we put in, at Gary's suggestion and insistence, to be fair, a system that relied upon what you would now call a server and dumb terminals situated at the secretary's desk and in our desk. From there, in 1981, so we have computerized records for, 42 years? That we can refer back to, and of course over the years we've updated, changed, and then along comes JMark in 2003 or thereabouts, and so since then we have relied on JMark Business Solutions for our technology needs. And I might say, a little bit of advertising, we have had great luck and great experience with JMark. It has made a huge difference in our practice. You can't practice law, you can't practice medicine without technology anymore. You can't do anything. You can't operate a business without some kind of technology.
Right.
So it's made a huge difference. We were lucky to get a head start over most, so we didn't have a bad learning curve as things changed. We just had to transition from this particular technology to the next upgrade of that technology.
Well, I think one of the things that really kind of helped you all in at the time, being an outsider looking in, was you had a culture around the technology, and I think that there's even businesses today that still fight that, but the culture of technology and using the tool as an asset to drive the business, to drive productivity, really had a big impact on how you guys could serve your clients.
Absolutely, no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's fun to see how it's evolved over the years and what it's turned into. You've talked a lot about the hospital, and you've talked a lot, or mentioned a few times the city and some of those things. Tell us a little bit about why it's been so important for you over the years to focus on the community and serving and making a difference. It's something you've instilled in our family, and something that's been near and dear to your heart.
Well, actually, it probably started with my granddad. It's a principle that if you take from a community by way of services, by way of money from providing services, if you take from a community, you have an obligation to return to that community. And my dad was a firm believer in that, and instilled that in me from the time I was a relatively young man. So when it came time to help the hospital get started, we hoped at the time, it was easy for me to say, sure, I'll do that. Because I owed it to the community, which had been very good to me, and is still very good to me.
Yeah.
So it was, that's not the only charitable part. I was on the chamber board, I was in Rotary, I was any number of charitable organizations. I created the school foundation that helps support the Bolivar schools. I've been involved in charities for all of my career, and I'm proud of that, and would encourage others who have the skills and knowledge, don't be afraid to reach out and find how those skills and knowledge can be used for the betterment of your community.
I love it. I love what you said about if you're taking from the community, you have a responsibility to give back. And I think that in today's world, there's a lot of folks who have lost that need a little reminder that how important it is.
Well, it's difficult to serve on a school board. It's difficult to serve on a city council. It's difficult to serve on a hospital board. It's difficult to serve on any kind of a public board because there's somebody out there isn't going to like your decisions, and maybe a lot of somebody's. But so I think that sometimes scares people away, but it shouldn't. If you've got the skills and the knowledge to contribute, you're the people. You're the one who needs to be serving, even in the face of occasional criticism or disagreement. That's my view.
Yeah, I think it's good advice. And because of your history and what you were able to do through the hospital, you took the time with Jim Sterling to write a book.
Yeah, Jim was the editor of the newspaper I talked about earlier. He later became the owner and the publisher, but back in, I don't know, it was shortly after I retired I retired in January 1 of 13. It was about 15 or 16. Jim sent me an email and said, write a book. And so he said, if we don't record the history, and it was an interesting history, if I do say so myself, if we don't record that history, it's going to be lost to posterity. So I said, okay, but right now I'm writing my memoirs for the benefit of my grandkids so that they'll know down the line, my great-grandkids even, something about me and their late grandmother. And said as soon as I finish that, we'll get started. So it took me a year or two to get finished with my memoirs, which I'm still not done with. But anyway, I've had to start all over because of subsequent events. But we started on the book, and we conducted many interviews of people that were involved. We went to the newspaper office, scanned the newspaper for stories, and my phone is still filled with copies of those articles. And then we agreed that Jim would write the first part of the book pertaining to the history, because he knew a lot of the history of Polk County, even better than I did, even though I was born and raised there. But the history of Polk County, and particularly the history of healthcare in Polk County, which was pretty poor. I mean, we had good doctors from time to time, but we just did not have a complete medical community as we came to need. So Jim wrote the first part. I wrote the part where after the hospital board was elected, the hospital district was formed, hospital was elected, and then we critiqued each other's writings, and then on some of it we kind of jointly wrote, and ended up publishing, I guess, 4 years ago, something like that.
Yeah.
2018 or 19. It's called The CMH Story.
And if somebody wanted to pick that book up, how do they do it?
It is available at the Missouri Library, Historical Library, and also, but if you want to buy it, the best way to do it would be through the gift shop at CMH, which they can call and get, or they can contact me. I've got copies that I'll sell. Actually, Jim and I assigned our copyright to the auxiliary of the hospital, so any proceeds from the book go to the auxiliary.
Oh, that's awesome.
We don't benefit from it at all.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, as we wind down, one of the questions that I like to close with, and I feel like it's extra special asking you, is what's one of the best pieces of advice over the years that you've received that you would want to share and pay forward?
I think the best piece of advice, I've already said it, the best piece of advice I ever received was from my dad, and that is, well, two pieces of advice. One of them was be completely honest and ethical in your practice. Do not bend the truth, much less lie. Do not take advantage of clients. Do not take advantage of even your opponents in an ethical manner. And I have always tried to live by that standard of being open, honest, completely ethical with my clients and with the public. The second piece of advice I received was, if you take from a community, you need to return to it.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly and love it. Well, Dad, thanks for taking the time to share some wisdom with us.
My pleasure.
I want to lift a glass to you and say that I'm proud that you're my dad. I love you, and thank you for everything that you've done.
Well, thank you, and I love you too.
Cheers to you.